They expected the ambassador to accept defeat gracefully when his accusation fell apart. What they did not expect was the quiet Maid standing near the window to recite, word for word, clause for clause, the entire original treaty from memory, in 3 languages, while every diplomat in the room sat frozen in disbelief. And in that impossible moment, the balance of power shifted not through force or title, but through something far more dangerous, a mind no one had bothered to notice. The accusation arrived on a morning thick with fog, carried into Ravencrest Hall by Ambassador Thorne like a blade hidden beneath silk. He was a man built for negotiation, sharp-featured and deliberate, whose reputation for dismantling opponents through patience rather than volume had made him invaluable to foreign courts. And he had come to destroy Duke Cassian Hale. The treaty in question had been signed 5 years earlier, a delicate agreement that secured trade routes and prevented war between 3 nations. It bore the Duke's seal, his signature, and had been honored without question until now. But Thorne arrived with documents of his own, older parchment, different wording, and the quiet confidence of someone who had already won. "This," Thorne said, placing his version on the polished table before the assembled council, "is the original treaty, the one your Duke signed. And if you compare it to the version currently enforced, you will find they are not the same." The room went deathly still. Duke Cassian Hale sat at the head of the table, his posture unchanged, his expression unreadable. He was a man in his late 20s whose stillness often unnerved those expecting theatrics. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. But now, faced with an accusation that could unravel years of diplomacy and paint him as either a liar or a fool, even his composure carried a different weight. "You are suggesting forgery," the Duke said quietly. "I am stating fact," Thorne replied smoothly. "The treaty you claim to uphold does not match the one you signed. Either you altered it after the fact, or someone in your household did. Either way, the agreement is void." Gasps rippled through the council. Foreign dignitaries exchanged sharp glances. One of the Duke's own advisors paled visibly, because if the accusation held, it would not merely embarrass Ravencrest, it would fracture alliances that had taken decades to build. The Duke's gaze did not waver. "I signed no forgery." "Then prove it," Thorne said. "Produce the original." Silence. Because the original treaty was not here. It had been archived in a distant vault, a 3-day journey away, deliberately stored beyond reach to prevent tampering. Standard practice. Unassailable logic. And now, weaponized against them. "You know it cannot be retrieved immediately," the Duke said. Thorne smiled faintly. "Then we have nothing further to discuss." He began gathering his documents, signaling to his attendants. Around the table, the council fractured into whispered panic. One advisor leaned toward the Duke urgently. "Your Grace, if he leaves now." "I know." But knowing changed nothing. Without the original document, without proof, the accusation would stand. And Thorne knew it. That was when she moved. Alara Finch had been standing near the far window, a shadow among shadows. Her role so minor that most guests forgot servants were even present. She poured wine when glasses emptied. She replaced documents when they were discarded. She existed in the margins of power, unnoticed and unimportant. Until now. "Clause 7, she said quietly. Every head turned. Thorne paused mid-motion, his hand still on the parchment. The Duke's gaze snapped toward her, sharp and uncomprehending. Alara stepped forward, her voice steady. "Clause 7 of the original treaty. It reads, no tariff shall exceed 5% of declared value on goods transported through the northern ports, provided said goods are listed in the approved registries maintained by all signing nations." She paused. "Your version says 3%, and it omits the registries clause entirely." The room went silent. Thorne's expression flickered, just briefly, before resettling into calm. "And you would know this how?" "Because I was present when the treaty was signed," Alara said. "I transcribed the ceremonial copy. I reviewed every line to ensure accuracy." It was true. 5 years ago, she had been a junior scribe, invisible even then, tasked with producing the ornamental version displayed in the Duke's Hall. She had spent 3 days with that document, copying each word with painstaking precision in 3 languages. And she had forgotten none of it. Thorne's smile thinned. "Memory is convenient. It is not proof." "Then test it," Alara said. The Duke leaned forward slightly, his gaze fixed on her now with something between confusion and fascination. "Alara." She met his eyes. "I can recite the entire treaty, word for word, in all 3 languages. If even one clause matches his version instead of yours, I will withdraw my claim." Thorne went very still, because that was not a bluff. That was a challenge. And if she succeeded, his entire accusation would collapse. The silence that followed her challenge felt heavier than the fog pressing against the windows outside. Because no one, diplomat, advisor, or duke, had ever considered that the quiet maid who refilled their wine might possess a mind capable of holding an entire treaty in perfect detail across 5 years. Yet there she stood, steady and unshaken, waiting. Ambassador Thorne recovered first. He leaned back in his chair with deliberate ease, though his fingers had stopped moving against the parchment. "An impressive offer," he said smoothly. "But memory, however confident, is not evidence. It can be mistaken, biased, convenient." "Then bring a scholar to verify," Alara replied. "Someone neutral. Someone who can compare my recitation to the archived original once it arrives. That will take days. Then we wait." Thorne's jaw tightened fractionally. Around the table, the council members exchanged uncertain glances, because the situation had just shifted in a direction none of them had anticipated. If the maid was wrong, the Duke's position would weaken further. But if she was right, the Duke rose slowly. Every eye turned toward him. "Alara," he said quietly, his tone unreadable. "You are certain?" "Yes, Your Grace." He studied her for a long moment, and something in his expression changed. Not doubt, recognition, as though he were seeing her clearly for the first time. "Then proceed." Alara inclined her head and turned toward the council. "The Treaty of Ashford Pass," she began, her voice clear and steady. "Signed on the 14th of June, year of our Lord 1793, between the Duchy of Ravencrest, the Kingdom of Valmar, and the free cities of the Eastern Shore." She paused, then continued without hesitation. Article 1. Sovereignty and mutual recognition. Each signing nation acknowledges the territorial sovereignty of the others as defined in the accompanying maps, witnessed and sealed separately. No nation shall contest borders agreed upon herein without formal arbitration. Her words fell into the room with absolute precision. No pause. No uncertainty. Each clause delivered as though she were reading from the parchment itself. Article 2. Trade and tariffs. Goods transported along the northern routes shall be subject to tariffs not exceeding 5% of declared value. Thorne's expression remained carefully neutral, but his posture had shifted. One of his attendants leaned forward, whispering urgently. Thorne silenced him with a glance. Alara continued through Article 3, then 4. Her voice never wavered. She did not stumble over legal phrasing or complex terminology. And when she reached Clause 7, the very clause Thorne had altered, she delivered it exactly as she had before, with the registry requirement his version had omitted. One of the Duke's advisors pulled out his own notes, cross-referencing frantically. His eyes widened. That matches our records exactly." "Of course it does," Alara said quietly, and continued. By the time she finished Article 6, the tension in the room had transformed into something closer to awe. She was not guessing. She was not approximating. She was reciting. Then she switched languages. "In la langue de Valmar," she said smoothly, transitioning into flawless Valmari. L'article September. Aucun tariff ini de passer 5%. A Valmari diplomat gasped audibly. She speaks it perfectly." Alara continued without acknowledging the interruption, moving through the next 3 articles in Valmari before shifting again into the Eastern Shore dialect, her pronunciation precise, her pacing unchanged. Thorne's face had gone pale, because this was not something that could be faked. Not across 3 languages. Not with this level of detail. And everyone in the room knew it. When Alara finally finished, 20 minutes later, having recited the entire treaty without error, the silence that followed was absolute. The Duke spoke first, his voice quiet but carrying unmistakable weight. "Ambassador Thorne, do you wish to contest her recitation?" Thorne did not answer immediately. His gaze remained fixed on Alara, studying her as though trying to understand what he had just witnessed. Finally, he said, "How?" It was not an accusation. It was genuine confusion. Alara met his eyes. "I read it carefully. No one remembers like that." "I do. The simplicity of her answer seemed to unsettle him more than arrogance would have. He looked down at his falsified document, then back at her. You could have been coached. By whom? Alara asked. I was not told of your arrival. I did not know you would bring a false treaty. I have been standing in this room since the council began, and I have spoken to no one. Thorne had no response. One of the Duke's senior advisors cleared his throat. Your Grace, if I may, this changes everything. If her recitation is accurate, and I believe it is, then the ambassador's document is clearly altered. Clearly. The Duke agreed, his gaze still on Alara. Thorne stood abruptly. This proves nothing until the original is retrieved. Then retrieve it, the Duke said. We will wait. And when it arrives, every word she spoke will be verified. And if even one clause differs, I will concede your accusation and dissolve the treaty myself. It was a dangerous gamble. But Thorne knew, they all knew, that the Maid had just destroyed his entire strategy. He gathered his documents in silence and left without another word. The council dissolved slowly after Thorne's departure, nobles and diplomats filtering out in hushed conversations that would undoubtedly spread across 3 nations by morning. But the Duke did not move. He remained at the head of the table, his gaze fixed on the woman who had just saved his reputation, his alliances, and perhaps his entire legacy with nothing but her memory. Alara had returned to her place near the window, hands folded, posture composed, as though she had not just accomplished the impossible. Alara, the Duke said quietly. Stay. The last advisor glanced between them, then exited discreetly, closing the door behind him. They were alone. The Duke stood and crossed the room slowly, stopping a respectful distance away. 5 years ago, he said, you were a scribe. Yes, Your Grace. And you have served as a maid since then. Yes. He studied her carefully, not with suspicion, but with something closer to disbelief. Why? Alara hesitated, then answered honestly. The scribe position was temporary. When it ended, I needed work. The household had an opening. I took it. And you never mentioned your abilities. They were not relevant to my duties. The Duke let out a breath that might have been a laugh if he were anyone else. Not relevant. You speak 3 languages fluently. You possess perfect recall. And you chose to remain invisible. Invisibility is often safer, Your Grace. The truth of that settled heavily between them. Because she was right. A woman with her intelligence, in her position, would have been seen as a threat or a curiosity, neither of which led to stability. You saved me today, the Duke said quietly. You understand that. I only spoke the truth. No. His voice was firm now. You did far more. Thorne came here to destroy me. He brought a forgery so carefully constructed that even my own council began to doubt. And you dismantled it without hesitation, without fear, without asking for anything in return. Alara met his gaze. You did not deserve to be accused falsely. Something in his expression shifted. And you believed I would listen. Even though you are, he stopped himself. A maid, she finished gently. Yes. The Duke looked away briefly, and when he spoke again, his voice was quieter. I have spent years surrounding myself with advisors, scholars, diplomats, people chosen for their intelligence and skill, and yet none of them could have done what you just did. They were not in the room when the treaty was signed. Neither should you have been, not as anything more than an afterthought. He paused. I did not even know your name until today. The admission clearly cost him something. Alara said nothing, because there was nothing to say. He was right. She had been invisible by design. That ends now. The Duke said firmly. I want you in my council. Alara blinked in genuine surprise. Your Grace, not as a scribe, not as a maid, as an advisor. Someone I can trust to see what others miss. I have no title, no formal education beyond. You have a mind sharper than anyone in this house, the Duke interrupted. And you have already proven your loyalty in the only way that matters. You spoke when you could have stayed silent. You risked being wrong, being dismissed, being humiliated. And you did it anyway. Alara's composure faltered just slightly. People will talk. Let them. His gaze was steady now, certain. I have spent too long caring about appearances while overlooking substance. You are the latter, and I will not make that mistake again. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Alara inclined her head. If you believe I can serve you well in that role, then I will accept. The Duke smiled, small, but genuine. I do. 3 days later, When the original treaty arrived and was verified word for word against Alara's recitation, the Duke made the appointment official. Ambassador Thorne's career ended quietly in disgrace. And Alara Finch, who had once existed in the margins, became one of the most trusted voices in Ravencrest Hall. Years later, when foreign diplomats visited and marveled at the Duke's uncanny ability to negotiate flawlessly across languages and cultures, they did not realize the woman standing beside him, elegant, composed, essential, had once been invisible. But the Duke never forgot, and every treaty signed at Ravencrest thereafter bore two seals, his and hers, because some minds, once recognized, change everything.